Panpan, please take it away.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll begin. Good afternoon, everyone. And today I want to share a topic about the influence of internet use on the gender income gap of migrant workers. Why we choose such a research problem? It's well known that equality between men and women is a lasting research problem. It includes political, social, and economic equality. And the economic one is basic to realize the true equality between men and women. But both globally and in China, the gender wage gap appears to be widening, even if in the migrant workers in China. Migrant workers is an important labor force in the China's labor market, and they play an important role in the development of China's economy. And the number of migrant workers in China has increased from 273.95 million in 2014 to 290.77 million in 2019. And the female migrant workers take a bigger proportion from the 33.96% in 2014 to 35.1% in 2019. And as we enter into 21st century, internet has played an important role in our daily life and work. So can the internet use in the workplace reduce the gender wage gap among the migrant workers? It caused our interest. So we try to find the answer. And about this research problem, there are many studies. The foreign studies have proved that the internet use can bring wage premium, and it can improve the wage income through two ways. First is it can improve the productivity directly and increase the wage income. Then it can, through an indirect way, internet use can contribute to job search, information acquisition, and online learning, and indirectly increase the users' wage income through the users' human capital increased. But there is a lot of skepticism about the gender wage income caused by internet use. In China, the researchers have proved the wage income of urban and rural residents can be significantly improved. And a few studies try to find the influence of the internet use in the gender wage gap, but they didn't use the variable of work in the didn't use the variable about the internet use in the workplace. It just used a general stating general variable is whether they use the internet in their work life in their daily life. So we try to find whether the use of the internet in the workplace can have the influence of the workplace use, the internet use in the workplace have a different influence on the migrant workers. Actually, scholars mainly focus as for the gender income gap. Most scholars focus on the impact of gender discrimination, and they think it's the most important reason for the gender wage gap among migrant workers. So can the internet use in the workplace reduce the gender discrimination and then narrow down the wage income among this group? We try to fill in this research gap. We just think we guess that maybe it will just reduce the gender wage gap. How it can take effect about the effect, how it can take the effect. We think that first, internet as a technology, it can reduce gender wage gap. There are researchers have proved that the technology can reduce the gender wage gap among the workers, especially for the people who have a lower education and lower skilled. And the migrant workers are just such a group that they have lower education and lower skilled in the China's labor market. And then we think that maybe it will reduce discrimination. Before the use of internet, the workers maybe between the migrant workers, the female and male. Actually, the female one have a natural have a weak physical condition than the male one. But the use of internet, especially we enter into the 21st century, more and more people work in the secondary in the service sector, and in such sector they use the internet. Maybe their disadvantage will turn into the advantage one. And then the next one we think maybe it's automation. Even if in the secondary industries such as manufacturing and construction sector, the people who the people in such sector in such industry, and the automation with the internet use can take the disadvantage of the male into advantage one maybe. And then it's about our data and model. We use the China Labor Force Dynamics Survey data 2014 and 2016. The model we use is the OLS regression and mismatch method, and the FL decomposition based on RF regression. Table 1 shows the descriptive statistics of variables. You can see the sample size and the distribution of the data from this chat. Then it's about the results. First, we analyze the influence of internet use on the gender wage of migrant workers. The model 1 is about the results of the OLS regression. From this chart, we can see that the migrant workers can enhance their wage income greatly through the use of internet at their workplaces. And model 2 is the mismatch methods. Whether we use the nearest neighbor matching methods or the radius matching methods or the kernel matching methods, it's the same results that people of the migrant workers using the internet at their workplace, they can increase their wage income. The third model is about the decomposition of gender wage income of migrant workers. From the results, we can see that the characteristic effect of the internet use in the 10 quartile and the 19 quartile and 15 quartile are positive, and in the 9 quartile is negative. And the coefficient effect of the internet use in the 10 and in the 10 and the 90 quartile, they are positive, and negative in the 50 quartile. So in general, the internet use will reduce the gender wage gap of middle and upper income migrant workers, but will widen the gender wage income of lower income migrant workers. Based on that, we do a further analysis. It's about the frequency of internet use on the gender wage gap of migrant workers. First, people who use the internet frequently, the average annual wage income of all samples and the male samples and female samples increased by about 11,600 yuan, 14,100 yuan, and 12,500 yuan respectively. Secondly, from the OLS regression results, we can see that the people who use the internet frequently, they can enhance their wage income greatly, especially for the female migrant workers. They enhance their wage greatly. It's 27.2%. Finally, the coefficient characteristic effect and coefficient effective of internet use frequency in each quartile are all negative, indicating that using the frequency of internet use at a workplace can reduce the gender discrimination and reduce the gender wage gap of migrant workers in various wage income groups. Last year is about our conclusion. First, the use of internet in the workplace can enhance the migrant workers, enhance the migrant workers significantly about their wages. Second, an influence of the coefficient of internet use on the wage income of migrant workers is a positive U-shape, while the gradual rise of female migrant workers' wage income. the influence of the internet use on increasing their wage income is more and more significant. The last one is the internet use can narrow the gender wage gap between middle and upper level workers, but it widens the gender wage gap between migrant workers in low wage income groups. But the increase of the frequency of internet use can narrow the gender wage gap in various wage income groups of migrant workers who are using the internet. That's all. Thank you for listening.
Yahi, I think you're muted.
Thank you for letting me know. I was just saying, I'll open it up to the audience if you have any questions. If not, I have one. I was wondering, Panpan, if you have an idea on whether these migrant workers also have an access to internet at home, or would this internet at the workplace be their only access? Panpan, you're muted. Oh, let me unmute you if you. Panpan, you're muted. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Actually, we just we try to check the influence of the internet use as a workplace. We just deem it as a technology in the workplace. So we didn't take care of the people who use the internet in their daily life for their entertainment or other things. We just use it as a variable in the workplace. In workplace, it will maybe improve your productivity. And
I see.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I was just wondering if their internet access at home would affect their may free up their job of searching or others. But I see
yes.
that in your study.
Actually, we just try to find that whether the internet use can, because we think the internet use can just make the female to balance their work life more easily than before.
I see.
And we will try to do that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Oh, I think we have one.
Yeah, is that
Yeah.
me? Okay,
Yes,
great.
yes.
Just a question, Panpan, can you just explain a little bit more about why gender discrimination is reduced among migrants who use the internet? Just the why of it. So why do you find?
Why do I
hear
discrimination is reduced?
Why is it you think that gender discrimination is reduced among migrant workers that use the internet?
Actually, from our data, through the, sorry, can I just share
Your slides?
Actually, I can say that. Actually, through the data, we can see that the decomposition results based on the FR decomposition based on the quantile regression. We can see that the characteristic effect and the coefficient effect are just reduced, especially when the female who use the internet frequently in their workplaces. That's the data can show us. And from the experience, we can see maybe the women who are people nowadays, more and more people, especially for the migrant workers, they work in the service sectors, and in certain sectors, maybe the females disadvantages characteristics will turn into an advantage one. For example, the male actually the male are natural weak than male in the physical condition, but in the different nowadays the internet use sectors, it will turn into advantage one, maybe we think, and through this I think maybe it will just reduce the discrimination among such among the migrant workers group.
Okay, great. We'll pass it over to the next presenter now.
Thank you.
So thank you, Panpan. So Salil, if you can share your screen.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Yahi.
No problem.
Okay. Is it visible to everyone? And am I clearly audible? Okay. Right, so here we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Salil Sapre, and I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations at Michigan State. Today, I'm going to discuss a curious case of an Indian feminist trade union. This trade union operated in one of the export-oriented garment industrial clusters in India. I specifically look at how the union engages with migrant workers. All right, so what is the big puzzle that I'm trying to solve here? So during my field work, I noticed that migrant female members were much less actively engaged with the union as compared to migrant males. This was counterintuitive and surprising because the union was a feminist union and the setting, the research context was feminized in that, as we know, in the global garment industry, most workers are women. So this is the question that kind of drives this project. Okay. Okay, so the literature talks about equity practices, basically a use for encouraging and promoting participation of migrant women. Essentially, they recognize the unique situatedness of migrant women or women in general in the gendered social order. So trade union education exclusively for women is one such practice. These programs are used to build labor awareness, self-confidence among women. They also shape feminist and radical ideologies. They enable women's leadership and also provide workers with safe spaces where women can exchange their experiences and in the process create sisterhood and solidarity. And this also improves women's participation. Another practice commonly noted in the literature is separate structures. So these structures can be, separate structures for organizing women or separate provisions for special interest groups within unions. But the literature also notes the engagement of, female union leaders and activists on the one hand and members, female members on the other. So union leaders motivate female members through the role model effect. They also emphasize women's interests and shape ideas around feminism. Their unionism is not confined to traditional bread and butter issues. And this encourages women to assume leadership positions as well as promote their participation within the union. So I'll talk in brief about my research questions. So I'm interested in examining the socio-cultural experiences of migrant female members in the union. Next, I ask, how does gender impact the degree to which migrant women and men participate in the union? And how is migrant women's union involvement really impeded in a feminized and a feminist setting? Moving on to the methods. So this work is based on qualitative inductive fieldwork in southern India over the last 3 summers. With Union 1, I use it as a pseudonym. And labor welfare, that's also a pseudonym. In fact, labor welfare was an NGO that was instrumental in the founding of Union 1, and they collaborated on various projects together. So I collected data in the form of 33 semi-structured interviews, a number of participant and non-participant observations, secondary sources, and informal interactions with participants. And I analyzed this data in Max QDA. So why the focus on migrants? Well, that is because migrants have become an increasingly prominent constituency in the industry, and also because of the counterintuitive observation that I discussed at the beginning of the presentation. So I'll go over my research setting really quickly. So in this cluster, the workforce comprised around 600,000 workers, and a chunk of them were women. Around 10% of the workforce was migrants, and as you can see, within the migrant category, around 80 to 90% were women. These were really young women with ages ranging from late teens to early 20s. They had come in from agrarian households in different states, and from traditional orthodox patriarchal settings. It's also important to point out here that India has around 28 states and more than 20 officially recognized languages. So what that means is these women, the language that was spoken in their home states was different from that spoken in the host state. So these migrant workers were linguistic minorities in the host state. Moving on to the union, it was a small union with a membership of around 6,000 workers. Its leadership were all women, and it subscribed to a feminist ideology. It had two activists. Rahul was a middle-aged man, and Pranjal was a woman in her early 30s. So there's a picture here which shows the gender composition and the age of the workforce. The peculiar characteristic of this setting was that migrants were organized in a separate structure, and the processes that the union followed with migrants was kind of gender blind. So it de-emphasized the gender aspect of the migrant workforce. Now, it's surprising to note that, because one might think that if the union is feminist, then why are they being gender blind? Well, the union was a prominent voice against wage disparity, sexual harassment at the workplace, or even domestic violence. But they were a grassroots organization, and they were still learning. So their feminism at the time of writing, it was still evolving, and it didn't really account for complex concepts like gender blindness or gender equity practices. So by default, their engagement with migrants was gender blind or equal rather than equitable. Okay, so now I move on to assessing internal union dynamics in the light of trade union education and safe spaces. So the union did have education for migrants, but it was focused on migrants as a group, and not, they didn't provide any specific education to women within the migrant worker group. As a result, a number of female participants complained that the discourse had masculine undertones, and they could not connect with the union narrative. A number of participants also mentioned that they were bored, and the language used in the discourse was simply incomprehensible. The union also provided safe spaces to migrants, again as a category. They wanted migrants to socialize and know each other, but these were mixed gender spaces. So, given the context, the cultural context that these folks came from, women ended up deferring to men. So they would refuse to participate in meetings in the presence of men or after men have spoken. Also, it was a taboo to interact with men outside of your family. So, and if you did that, there was a danger of you being tagged as a loose woman. So women also safeguarded their reputation by withdrawing from the union altogether. So this shows how the focus on migrants as an overarching category, led to migration status being exercised as a new form of gender blindness. I have some quotes here again, but we can come back to these quotes during the Q&A in the interest of time. So I'll go to the next slide. This shows how the internal union dynamics became gender blind, and this is explained in the context of engagement with leaders and activists. I explained earlier how important it was for leaders and activists to engage with women members, especially to motivate their participation. But because of the language barrier in this case, there was no interaction possible between leaders and migrants, right? So this wasn't really a problem for men, and neither did this really discourage the participation of migrant women, but it certainly failed at encouraging it. Also, the union had employed, as I discussed before, two activists to engage with migrants as a group. Remember, these are not separated based on, dealing with migrant men or migrant women. So the male activist, Rahul, he was a more senior figure, more experienced, and demographically quite dissimilar from the workers he was trying to engage with. So many workers reported that, they felt shy or scared to interact with him. That wasn't a problem for men. But many women also said that, if the female activist was the only one engaging with them, then perhaps they could have been, they could have felt more welcome in the union to participate further. So these practices show how, these practices were detrimental to, particularly to migrant women, and this ended up in, migrant status again becoming a form of gender blindness. All right, so moving on to the implications, the most important implication from this study, in my view, is migrant status as a novel form of gender blindness. We've talked a lot about, or the literature speaks a lot about how class is a gender blind category, but this shows that migration status can also be a gender blind, a form of gender blindness. This study also brings to the fore that it's important to understand the mechanics that prevent women from participating, and even feminist unions are not immune from this phenomenon. This work also highlights the importance of equity practices, and there's also some scope for future research in this work. For instance, the dynamics observed for natives were quite interesting. Native women participated to a greater extent in the union than did native men. And it remained unclear why that was the case, given that the union ideology was still evolving. My speculation is that perhaps over a period of time, contingent practices had evolved that cater to the interests of native women. Also, it would be interesting to assess how the union interacted with individuals belonging to other gender categories. This research was kind of delimited by two major gender categories, male and female. Also, this work does not account for workers' agency in that assessments of how workers exercised agency to participate in the union remained a bit out of the scope of this work. So it would be interesting to study that, in the face of active or even unintentional union resistance. So that's about it. Thank you so much. I hope I'm not over. Oh,
it's fine. We have,
sorry about that.
No worries. We have set the time conservatively, so we have some flexibility with that. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise a hand or put down on the chat box. Yeah, we have one, Maite. You can unmute yourself, and thank you.
It's a great presentation. Can you give us an example of union practices towards equality versus equity and the effect that has on member participation? So to kind of clearly tease out what the difference could be between equality, equity, and the effect on participation.
Yeah, so one practice that I discussed was, education. Now, what's important there is to what extent it caters to the interests of women. Now, we know that, union education can be, it can deal with bread and butter issues, economic issues, but trade union education that is catered to women's interests would also include, healthcare, sexual health, reproductive health, childcare, all these aspects combined. And because of that, the literature also mentions that it gives women a better understanding of what unions do, because it's noted that women are less likely to be aware of what unionism is all about. So when courses are shaped according to women's situatedness and understanding, that can help them better to participate within the union apparatus, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
We have another question by Ariane and Amanda.
Hello, this is Ariane Hegovish. Salil, it was a really interesting paper. Could you say a little bit more about this, your theme that the focus on the situation of migrant workers may is gender blind, or may repress women's interests or women's participation? I was not quite clear how this worked in practice. Thanks.
Okay, so are you asking what I meant by gender blindness?
No, I'm asking how because I guess in the United States, a lot of the work around migration is by now fairly gender focused. Mm-hmm. And so, so I'm just trying to better understand how exactly the focus on migration limited women's agency or pushed them out of the union.
Yeah, so as I explained in the last two slides, I'll give you an example. Now, there were two activists that the union engaged to deal with or to mobilize and organize migrant women. Now, these women were really young, early 20s or late teens. And the male activist was in his mid-40s, experienced and an imposing man, if you ask me. So what happened was, in some of the interviews, women, these really young women said that they were not sure how to interact in his presence, or they should even speak in his presence, because they were scared to sound stupid. They always felt that men gossiped behind their backs, and that was the dynamics that happened. So they told me that, if the other activist who was a woman in her mid-30s, who was demographically a bit similar to migrant women, if she was the only one who was assigned to organize and mobilize migrant women, it could have helped them better to engage with the union. But the presence of the male activist deterred their participation, and the union did not account for the fact that there was so much difference in the demographics, right? So that is just one example of how migrant women's participation was kind of discouraged in the union, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Yep.
Do we have time for one more question? Or
so we have another question by Ting Zhang. Actually, could we hold off until after the last presentation? We'll have a few minutes to cover your question, but
sure,
just to make sure that Pooria has enough time. Thank you. If you could put down your questions in the chat box, that would be great to remember that we go back to your questions.
Can I start? Okay. All right, so I think.
So I'm kind of curious about that, whether that will affect your result. And also earlier in the discussion, you mentioned about most of the women there participating are, relatively young, kind of prime age, right? So like early 20 to 40s, that's what you said earlier, right? If that's the case, don't you think the family obligation, particularly for women, could be an important reason for them to dedicate time for a union? Because that could be a big barrier. And particularly for a lot of countries, right? The female, in actually most cultures, still the main, child caretaker, right? So any other family obligations as well. So I'm not sure whether that's kind of competing of the time they could commit to that. That could be one big reason. Another possibility, I'm thinking of the social barrier, because if women feel, okay, even if we have activists, union or club, whatever, but whatever we do, whatever we wanted to advance, our rights, eventually that does not take effect in a society. If the supporting mechanism in a bigger background is not there, then why they even do that? So I'm just curious, wonder more. Thank you so much.
Yep. Those are really great questions. So I'll start by answering the second question first about family obligations. Your observation about family obligations is correct, but that's confined to Native women. These are migrant women, and most of them live in dormitories, which are provided by the employer. So their families are away, and they stay, they stay alone without their families within those dormitories or hostels. That is what they're called in that particular setting. With respect to the appointment of the male activist, that's again a great question. So the union makes sure that they do not involve males in their leadership positions. So there are 4 leaders, and they are supported by an executive committee, and it all consists of women. The activist, though, he cannot get promoted in the union. He cannot go beyond being an activist. That is the most he can do by remaining in the union. But he was appointed because, as you mentioned, he was a charismatic man, and the union also considered reaching out to other men in the government sector because, again, this is a grassroots organization, so they are not immune from, certain gender stereotypes. So there was some discussions within the union that if they could recruit men as well, then maybe it could help the union advance their cause, if you will. Could you please repeat your third question again? I'm sorry, I did not follow that.
Thank you for answering those questions, by the way. My third question was about the social stigma. As you said, the feminist organization is not immune of the social gender bias. And also because of that, because the social barriers there, even if they have feminist group, and if most of women feel no matter we participate or not, it doesn't really eventually help us. So eventually they're just not interested. Instead, they become an organization for the selected male to have a stage. So.
Yes, social stigma is definitely an aspect, but interestingly, most of these women, they got like an hour only to speak to their families, and many of them did not even discuss that they participated in a union. So the social stigma aspect vis-a-vis their families did not really play in this context, if that answers your question. But certainly I would like to add that, employer antagonism, it definitely played a role, and the dynamics, the internal union dynamics that prevented women from participating in the union, that effect was above and beyond that resulting from, employer antagonism. If that answers the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think our time is up for this session. Thank you for joining in, and thank you for the presenters for wonderful papers. Let me make sure that I upload these recordings to cloud.
And thanks.